In the previous lesson, what we did was spend some time talking about the Chartist movement, the first of our major political movements that were demanding universal suffrage. The aim for the AQA specification, of course, is to essentially examine and to analyze the significance of these various different movements. As I've just mentioned, the first of these movements was the Chartist movement. This lesson is going to talk about the Suffragists movement. Okay. Now, generally speaking, we obviously delineate between the Suffragists and the Suffragettes, even though they were technically seeking to achieve the same outcomes, but there was obviously a significant difference in terms of their methods and in terms of the levels of militancy that was influenced by each of these movements. So we're going to examine arguably the most famous of these universal suffrage movements. The Suffragists and the Suffragettes are indeed, and without a doubt, at least in the United Kingdom, the most ardent and most famous universal suffrage movements. We'll take an introduction to what the Suffragists and the Suffragettes actually believed. We'll talk about their methods, and we'll talk about their legacy towards the end of the lesson. So, the activity of the Suffragists movement was primarily between the late 1800s, specifically around 1890, stretching all the way to the end of the First World War. Now, the reason why they sort of become less important and less relevant after the end of the First World War is because, of course, of the fact that women then begin to get the vote as the result of a variety of different shifts in campaigning and lobbying, and as also the impact of the First World War itself. The British suffragists movement was fundamentally a campaign that was aimed at securing the right to vote for women through peaceful and through constitutional means, i.e. lobbying the changing of the law in order to allow women to vote. The movement for women's suffrage began, like I said, in the 1800s. It began specifically in the mid-19th century, the 1800s, but it gained this significant momentum as we go into the 1890s, and we start to see the British suffragists movement gain a foothold in both terms of their influence, and also in terms of their popularity. Early organisations included things like the Langham Place Circle, which of course laid the groundwork for later efforts. You can always and should always analyse these different movements through the lens of the preceding movements that existed prior to the suffragists and the suffragettes, because of course they didn't come out of nowhere. The suffragists movement didn't just appear out of thin air. They developed over time through the groundworks that was laid by earlier women's rights activists. The Industrial Revolution, just like according to the Chartist movement, had led to a number of changes to women's roles in society. Unlike the Chartist movement, you see that the Industrial Revolution has quite a significantly negative impact on the working classes. But for women, the Industrial Revolution led to an increased involvement for women in public life and in labour. This, of course, highlighted the contradictions to their lack of political rights. Why is it that they now, as women start to spend more time in public life, start to have more influence in terms of working in factories, working in labour-related professions, but yet still maintain lesser rights than that of men working those same jobs? Of course, there is therefore a contradiction in both the way society views women politically at this time period and the actual practical work that women are doing during the Industrial Revolution. In 1897, we see Millicent Fawcett introduce and create the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. This was the main organisation which represented the suffragists movement. It was an umbrella organisation, so what that means is it was a sort of organisation that was encompassed by a majority of other organisations. There were more smaller, more on-the-ground organisations that were represented by the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Fawcett herself was a very key leader. She was known for her strategic and, most importantly, non-violent approach to campaigning, trying to achieve the suffrage for women through the use of non-violent political and legal and specifically constitutional reforms. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies focused on things relating to lobbying, focused on petitions, it focused on peaceful demonstrations, it focused on public education in order to gain support for women's universal suffrage and to try and force the government to do something about it, similar to how pressure groups work to this day. In terms of its impact and in terms of its legacy, one of the main things that was a huge driving factor in the ability for women to eventually get universal suffrage was, of course, the First World War. Many suffragists, in fact, supported the war effort, believing that demonstrating their patriotism towards the war effort and to essentially do a lot of hands-on contributions to society will ultimately strengthen their case for universal suffrage. The culmination of years campaigning came with the passage of the Representation of the People Act in 1918 at the end of the First World War. This granted women over 30 who met minimum property qualifications the vote. Now, on the one hand, this is a significant victory. This is the first time in British history that women are given the vote in 1918. Although, as noted and has written here, this is still nevertheless a partial victory because of the fact that there were caveats for women being able to have the vote. You had to be over 30 and you had to own property. So even though this significantly expanded the franchise, it significantly expanded the number of people who could vote, it still nevertheless did not create universal suffrage for all women. The full suffrage for women on the same terms as men, so essentially the achievement of parity between men and women, came with the 1928 Representation of the People Act, Representation of the People Equal Franchise Act. So it took another 10 years for this to actually have an influence and have an impact on essentially achieving parity with men, achieving a certain degree of consistency between men and women. Still, it was over the age of 21, but nevertheless, it was the achievement of what we would describe as universal suffrage today. Many of the former suffragists who had lobbied for the right for women to vote continued to be very, very active in politics, very, very active in social reform, and they influenced various different aspects of public policy and women's rights beyond universal suffrage. Because fundamentally, from the perspective of feminist philosophy and feminist political theory, the achievement of universal suffrage is really just step one in the achievement of equal rights between men and women. And so feminist and women's rights activists would continue, even to this day, talking about and trying to get greater influence over the achievement of women's rights beyond that of just universal suffrage.